Thanks for coming. My name is Lee Freeman. I'm the public historian at the Florence Lauderdale Public Library. Happy to do this All Saints tour, even though All Saints was a couple of days ago. We're doing it on a Saturday because it's way more convenient for most people. So this is a walk-in tour of downtown historic churches that are within what I would consider fairly easy walking distance. So you can see the ones in the program that we'll go to. Florence has always been a city of prayer. One of the first things the original settlers did way back in 1818, after that first land sale, when they had founded the town, which of course was founded by the Cypress Land Company, which then was headquartered in Huntsville, led by John Coffey, James Jackson, and those guys, was to found churches and then schools. The very first church, which is considered Florence's mother church, is First Presbyterian Church, which was founded in July of 1818, a mere days after the first land sale. It was probably a log or brick structure, and it was followed very soon in 1822 by the Methodist Church and in 1824 by the Methodist Church. Now, interestingly enough, the Baptists only came to Florence in 1859 with an African American Baptist church, St. Mark Missionary Baptist Church. Catholics had been in Florence, in the area, probably with Ferdinand Sonona and his brother. They were Catholic Italian immigrants from 1818. One document that we looked at said that there were about 200 Catholics in the northwest Alabama counties that would become Lauderdale, Colbert, and Franklin by 1830. So there was just no established church for them. So Sonona and his brother attended church at First Methodist because there was no Catholic parish yet. The first Catholic church came to Lauderdale County in 1872 with the German colonists at St. Florian. The first Catholic church in Florence was only founded in 1878 by Reverend Father Benedict Minguez, Order of St. Benedict, who later went on to become the first abbot of St. Bernard Monastery down in Cullman. He founded what is now St. Joseph Catholic Church in 1878. So they're 20 years older than their historic marker says, because I had that information 20 years ago and didn't know anybody to give it to from the church. So they're working on updating their historical marker. Now, the Churches of Christ are one group with the Disciples of Christ and independent Christian churches that came out of the Stone Campbell Reformation, which resulted when two Christian reform and unity movements, Stone's Christians and the Campbell's Reformers, officially united on New Year's Day in Lexington, Kentucky in 1832. The first Christian churches came to Lauderdale County in 1824 with what is now Stony Point Church, back then Republican, but the first Church of Christ only came to Florence proper in 1886 when a congregation was founded through the efforts of men like T.B. Larimore. Now, the Salvation Army's been here since about 1905. They founded missions in the Tri-Cities and has been an active and important force in the community for nearly 120 years. By 1907, the Salvation Army's Florence Post Hall and headquarters were located at 120 Intelligence Row, the street of primarily law offices behind the courthouse, now known as Short Court Street, but they called it Intelligence Row. So that's where their first offices were. Then you have the Holiness people coming, that they started doing revivals in East Florence in 1902. They were followed in 1904, they built their first permanent tabernacle. The Holiness evangelists were followed by the Pentecostal evangelists, and Pentecostalism only started in 1907 in Azusa Street in California. So April of 1908 is pretty quick to get the first Pentecostal revivalists here in East Florence. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod comes to Florence in 1939. By now, we have the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or Mormons, who came in 1969. Florence has nearly every major Protestant Christian denomination. We've got Assemblies of God, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, non-denominational churches. You name it, we've got one in Florence. The Christian faith, of course, has always been integral to the black community. The oldest black congregation in Florence is what is now Greater St. Paul AME Church, which was founded around 1840 by about 13 or 14 slaves and freedmen who had been congregants at the Methodist Church. Founded sometime around 1840 with the assistance of white trustees of the Methodist Church. The first black public school, the Freedmen's Public School, was founded in 1866 by the Pittsburgh Freedmen's Aid Commission in Church Springs Methodist Episcopal Church, because it was founded on lot number 311, the southwest corner of Court and Bluff Streets. So maybe you've seen the historical marker for that church. It's actually in the wrong location because they didn't look at the actual deed when they wrote it, the historical marker. So the Church Springs, as the oldest church, was followed in 1859 by what is now St. Mark Missionary Baptist Church. First Congregational Church came in 1876, founded by the American Missionary Association. The Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, now known as the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, was founded in 1870 by former African American churches that had been affiliated with the AME Church, with the Methodist Church, with the white Methodist Church. Some of the early on in the late 1700s, early 1800s, several congregations of African Americans formed their own African Methodist Episcopal denomination. The rest stayed with the white Methodist churches. So those black Methodist churches that had not been AME churches pulled out and formed the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. And Florence got a congregation of that faith in 1887. A black Presbyterian congregation was in existence by 1894. And Bethel Cumberland Presbyterian Church was founded on East Alabama Street in 1897, probably by members of that original black Presbyterian church. The first African American congregation of the Church of Christ came in 1928 with the East Alabama Street Church of Christ. After it was founded by 10 converts after noted evangelist Brother Marshall Keeble did a meeting in Florence. And originally there was a lady named Sister Rowell who was the first convert, and she met in a segregated room at what is now Wood Avenue Church of Christ, if you can believe that. So they were originally segregated, and then they founded their own church in 1928. In 1956, the Unitarian Universalist faith came. Their original headquarters were at Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall number 5140 at 454 North Pine Street, and Atherton Hastings was their first president, with James C. Foster of Sheffield as vice president. And this church still meets in facilities at 1332 North Pine Street. And of course, we had Jewish settlers in the Tri-Cities, or what became the Tri-Cities, and in Florence by the early 1840s. The first Jewish temple, Temple B'nai Israel, was founded in Sheffield in 1906. It moved to Florence in 1953 because, according to the late Alvin Rosenbaum, his dad Lewis didn't like driving the 15 minutes from Florence to Sheffield, or not even 15 minutes. So Lewis said, we need to build the temple over here so I don't have to drive as far. So it relocated here in 1953. And interestingly enough, Friday night, October 25th, 1957, Dr. J.S. Gollinger was formally installed as rabbi of Temple B'nai Israel, one of several, with Reverend J.V.C. Summerall of First Presbyterian Church offering the invocation as a representative of the Florence Christian ministers, and Reverend John C. Calhoun of Sheffield's First Methodist Church representing Colbert County ministers. So it's interesting how there was this spirit of fellowship and cooperation among the Christian churches and the Jewish temple way back in 1957. And in fact, Florence had at least one Jewish member of the Board of Aldermen or City Council, a guy named Morris Copland, a Russian Jewish merchant who came here from Russia by way of New York. He got elected to the City Board of Aldermen in 1901. So there's never been any kind of friction or animosity, not any big friction or animosity between the Christian churches and the Jewish temple. By 1895, a Christian Ministers Association was organized whose stated goal was to, quote, bring the clergy of the city into more active cooperation in all good work, to strengthen social relations and religious work, to advance the benevolent work of the city, and generally to act in concert to advance the religious and moral interests of the city. And that group continues to this day through the Shoals Ministerial Alliance, which is comprised of three area black and white pastors and clergy, and they still are active. By 1896, First Presbyterian, First Methodist, and First Baptist were holding what they called union services at various times, especially on Thanksgiving. In addition, pastors of the various Christian denominations would take turns speaking at the Florence and East Florence YMCA in the 1880s and 1890s. But the African American churches in the 1950s, they formed their own Tri-Cities Interdenominational Alliance, which was active into the 1970s. And one of the most important things this group ever did was they got Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., the father of slain civil rights activist Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to speak in February of 1970 at First Baptist Church in Sheffield. So Martin Luther King Jr.'s dad spoke in the Tri-Cities because of this Tri-Cities Interdenominational Alliance. So now we're actually going to start on the tour. So I wanted to give set that off with a little background. So the first stop is the Wood Avenue Church right over here. The ancestry of Wood Avenue Church of Christ is the Poplar Street Church of Christ, which will be the next stop on the tour. And this particular building was built in the 1970s. The couple of their members wrote a history of their church in like 1986, where they detailed the history, did a really good job detailing the history of Wood Avenue / Poplar Street. But you'll recall the first Churches of Christ only came to Florence in 1886. They had been in the county since 1824. But I'm not going to say a whole lot about Wood Avenue, but it's a beautiful building, and it's still a very active congregation, and they've got a historical marker. So the next stop will be Poplar Street Church of Christ, which is now Calvary Fellowship. This is what used to be the Poplar Street Christian Church / Church of Christ. And after Stone and Campbell's two Christian Reform and Unity movements merged in 1832, they were known by various names as the Christian Church, sometimes the Church of Christ, sometimes Disciples of Christ. Unfortunately, there have been a couple of splits. A 1906 split into mostly Churches of Christ and then mostly Northern Disciples of Christ. Then a further split in the 1920s into independent Christian churches and Disciples of Christ. So unfortunately, the Christian Reform and Unity movement has split several times and exists as three major traditions. But it was known for most of its early years as Poplar Street Christian Church, even though its address is technically on Tom Bigby Street, 424 East Tom Bigby Street. They chose the name Poplar Street because maybe they liked it better. But according to the Florence Banner of April 1st, 1886, the first meeting of what became the Poplar Street Christian Church was in the home of a woman named Mrs. Susan Y. Thrasher, who interestingly enough had been a Unionist during the Civil War. A lot of local people were opposed to secession, and she was one of them. On the northwest corner of Court and Tuscaloosa Streets in March of 1886. They quickly outgrew the house and they moved to Luddick's Hall, which was upstairs at the southwest corner of Court and Tom Bigby later that month. And then T.B. Larimore and other evangelists would rotate in preaching. Stone Campbell churches did not typically have salaried located preachers at that time because they were afraid of a clergy-laity divide, and they were afraid of pastors being so concerned about drawing a paycheck and having their ministerial credentials that they would have different evangelists rotate to do the preaching. By June of that year, 1886, the fledgling congregation had moved to Morrison Hall. By July, Mrs. Thrasher had bought a lot on Tuscaloosa Street, which she gave to the church, but for whatever reason, and I've never been able to figure out why, they never built a lot or built a church on that lot. But they did build this building in 1890 right here on the corner of Poplar and Tom Bigby, and they chose the name Poplar Street. The building, of course, is of Gothic design. It's brick with a 100-foot high bell tower. The main building is 84 by 50 feet, with the sanctuary being 56 by 50 feet. It had, I don't know if it still does because I've never been in this building, believe it or not, but it had 2 dressing rooms and a baptistry behind the pulpit. The dressing rooms were for people about to be baptized. They'd put on clothes to get baptized in so their normal clothes wouldn't get wet. Florence architect F.L. Rousseau of the firm Rousseau and Bracken designed the building, which was built by Nashville contractor John Zink for $4,500. Couldn't build anything for $4,500 now. In 1970, Poplar Street Church of Christ moved to Wood Avenue and built that beautiful church we just left. The old Poplar Street building is now the home of Calvary Fellowship. And I've never been in that building, but it is one building that I would like to see have a historical marker because it dates to 1890. So this is Our Redeemer Lutheran Church, which was built in 1938 at 630 North Poplar. And by the way, if anybody is a member of any of the churches we stop at, let me know. I'd be interested in knowing if we have any members of any of these churches present. Interestingly enough, there was no congregation of Lutherans in Lauderdale County until Finnish settlers settled the Cloverdale area. If you go up Wood Avenue, which runs into Cloverdale Road, 8 or 9 miles north and west of Florence, there was a Finnish community that came there in the 1880s. Cloverdale initially was named Rawhide, and then 2 ladies moved into the area from like Indiana or somewhere and thought Rawhide sounded too crude and unsophisticated, and could they please change it to Cloverdale? So they changed the post office to Cloverdale, but other older residents know it as Rawhide still. So, and in some of those Finnish settlers' homes, a lot of those homes still exist, and a lot of those homes still have the saunas out back of the homes where they would take their steam baths. So this church was actually founded in Florence in 1938. When in 1936, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and the Lutheran Church exists in different branches, but the Lutheran Synod, or the Missouri Synod of the Lutheran Church, in 1936 sent a ministerial candidate named Richard Haas to Florence to investigate the feasibility of establishing a Lutheran congregation here, which he did. In the meantime, Reverend Haas conducted Lutheran services at several locations in Lauderdale County, such as Cloverdale and Killeen. That surprised me. I didn't realize Killeen had any members of the Lutheran faith. But I know some of the German colonists at St. Florian, they were primarily German Catholics, but there were a few Lutherans among that group. So Reverend Haas did services for those folks when he could. A congregation was officially established in Florence in 1938. The building cost $7,000, and it was at 626 North Poplar Street, the original address. It was built in 1939 from plans drawn up by Walter Seaman, with the sanctuary officially dedicated Sunday, December 8th, 1940, by the Reverend E.T. Ton of St. Paul's Lutheran Church, Decatur. The first pastor of the church, full-time located pastor, was the Reverend Edmund Lammert, who was pastor from 1938 to 1945, who replaced Reverend Haas in August of 1937. And the photo in the program is from the 1970s. Every year they have a nice little Christmas Eve service, and I've been a couple of times. They don't serve communion like some of the other churches, but they have a really nice candlelight service every year at Christmas. And it's a beautiful little church.
Is that a parsonage next to it, or is that
I think originally that might have been the parsonage, but I'm not sure. I should have checked on that. This is, of course, First Baptist Church, which, if you've read their historical marker, you know, was founded in 1888. As I said before we actually started the tour proper, the Baptist Church only came to Florence in 1859 with the African American congregation of St. Mark Missionary Baptist Church, which is interesting because there were Baptist churches all over the county, Methodist churches of Christ all over, but for whatever reason the Baptists only came here in 1859, and then the white Methodist Church Baptist Church only came in 1888. This church was founded on May 27th, 1888, at the courthouse in Florence, after a commencement address by the Reverend W.H. Smith, and it was known as First Missionary Baptist Church, which interestingly back then, a lot of times they would use one of the courthouse rooms as an assembly hall for lectures, for concerts, and for church services. I don't know if you could do that now. Somebody might say it's a violation of church and state, but this church started in the courthouse, and at that time, 1888, a young W.C. Handy had a part-time job as a custodian or janitor in the courthouse, and in his memoirs, he specifically mentions cleaning up after, or having to, that the Baptist church was meeting in the courthouse, and he would have to clean the rooms after their services. After funds ran out for a proposed limestone building for this church, a 72 by 40 Gothic-style temporary wooden structure was erected on East Tom Bigby Street between 1889 and 1890, which was dedicated on Sunday, April 13th, 1890, with the sermon being given by Reverend G.A. Lofton of Nashville. Again, F.L. Rousseau of the firm Rousseau and Brecken of Florence was the architect, and L. Paget was the contractor. The first pastor of this church was Reverend J.C. Hudson. Their pastorium was built between 1890 and 1891 during the pastorate of Englishman Reverend Dr. Richard Hall. The original temporary wooden structure burned in July of 1909, and a second brick sanctuary was completed in 1910 for $12,000 with Harry Austin as contractor, and a third sanctuary was constructed in March in 1963. So this building up here is the third building on their campus. They now own the old library building just on the other side of this complex. And interestingly enough, in March of 1911, Florence's first Boy Scout troop was organized right here at First Baptist. So they pretty much own the whole block now. So the next stop is First Presbyterian Church, and I was just thought about this as we were coming to this spot. The spot where the library is now was originally one of the lots owned by Ferdinand Sonona, the guy that laid out and designed, John Coffey did the original plat, and Peel and Sonona resurveyed it. So Sonona had a house here back in the 1820s to about 1858. By 1889, from 1889 until the mid-1930s, it was the Lauderdale Clubhouse, was built in 1889 it was a club for businessmen and industrialists in Florence, Lauderdale County. Then it was the home of N.C. Elting, who was affiliated with First National Bank. Later it was a funeral home, a Brown and Service funeral home. That building was torn down in the 1960s to build a tire store, and now the library's there, so you got that for free. Where we are now is, of course, First Presbyterian Church. They have their historical marker. First Pres has the distinction of being what is called the Mother Church of Florence, because they were the first church right here at 224 East Mobile Street. And most of this building right here, that's the original brick sanctuary that was built. First Presbyterian is Florence's oldest church, known as the Mother Church. On July 22nd, 1818, quote unquote, Hugh Campbell of the Presbyterians bought lot number 84 in Florence for $1,600, and then they quickly built probably a frame or log building on this site, which by 1824 was replaced by this building. In 1898, 1899, the facade of the 1824 brick church was remodeled, but it's basically the same building. First Presbyterian's first recorded pastor was the itinerant missionary pastor, Reverend Gideon Blackburn. Sunday morning, now this is really interesting. Among the many important and interesting things that happened here, Sunday morning, July 27th, 1862, Reverend Dr. William Henry Mitchell was arrested. Their pastor was arrested in his pulpit by Union Provost Marshal and future U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Marshall Harlan on charges of treason and sedition after making his customary prayer for the welfare of Jefferson Davis and the Confederate States of America. General Grant had earlier, just not long before this time, issued orders that any Southerner heard to be making statements supportive of the Confederate government be arrested on charges of treason and sedition. So Harlan was following orders. After the service, they promptly marched up, put Reverend Mitchell in shackles, marched him out of the sanctuary in the hot sun, and Sally Foster, who was a 16-year-old girl at the time at Courtview Mansion, what is now Rogers Hall, wrote, because she was a member of the church's school, the Female Synodical College, wrote that they wouldn't even let Reverend Mitchell have an umbrella to shield him from the sun. The Union soldier said, "You can stand the heat as well as we can." So he was a prisoner in a Union POW camp in Alton, Illinois for 6 months until his release, and pretty much he had to walk back or fend his own way back. We've actually got his prison record at the library. We've got his oath of amnesty, where he basically had to petition President Johnson after the war for the charges of treason and sedition against him to be dropped. He had to take an oath of allegiance that he would not take up arms against the United States government, because Reverend Mitchell was decidedly pro-Confederate. He was at the secession convention in Montgomery. He was pro-Confederate, but he was in prison for 6 months. From 1855 until 1899, First Presbyterian had the oversight of the Presbyterian Female Synodical College, located on the site of the present John McKinley Federal Post Office building. This school trained young Presbyterian women. They also accepted young girls from other Christian denominations as students, and it trained these young women to take their places in the genteel society of the home and the drawing room. So we are almost in front of it's now the Tennessee Valley Community Church. It was originally founded as First Congregational Church sometime around 1876, and was in operation as First Congregational Church until sometime around 1939. Around 1939, St. Paul AME Church had a separation, a split, and so one faction of their church moved into this location and became the Methodist Community Church, and then Greater St. Paul AME Church, now exists on College Street across from Burrell. But this congregation, or a congregation on this site, was founded sometime around 1876. I'm not sure of the precise date from the newspapers, but it was founded, they laid a cornerstone for a new building. Well, this church was founded through the auspices of the American Missionary Association of New York. They already had a building here by June 15th, 1879, when they laid the cornerstone for a new building on Pine Street, quote, on the Donovan lot where their present church stands, unquote. So, of course, this was a church for African Americans, a congregational church. The building was constructed with financial assistance from the American Missionary Association of New York, and the earliest recorded pastor was Reverend L.C. Anderson, who was succeeded in September of 1878 by South Carolina native Reverend W.H. Ashe, who was here until 1882. This congregation also conducted the Carpenter or Canaan High School. It was sometimes called the Canaan High School because the church is technically located in what was known as the Canaan subdivision of Southwest Florence, which was a primarily African-American subdivision named after a freed slave named Cain Leach. So the church oversaw the Carpenter or Canaan High School. Originally the pastors of the church were the principals. This congregation dissolved sometime around 1939 or 1940. I don't know exactly when it or why it dissolved, because it had been in one of Florence. It's the third oldest church in Florence and one of the most active churches in Florence. It needs a historical marker. The Dred Scott historical marker is just down there. It's actually in the wrong location too. It needs to be like right there. But they did the best they could when they put that up. We didn't know exactly where to put that marker, so they got as close as they could at the time. But since then, we found the deed record that tells us exactly where the blow-in was. So anyway, the first Congregational church founded sometime around 1876, which now exists as the Tennessee Valley Community Church, which is still an active congregation. So I've got, this is Trinity Episcopal Church, Florence's third oldest Protestant Christian church, which was founded in 1824. We're at 410 North Pine Street. Trinity was founded in 1824 by the Episcopal minister Reverend William Spencer Wall, who also began a school on Cedar Street in Florence. A congregation was first organized in 1836 by the Reverend Thomas Armstrong Cook. And the first building was built on the northwest corner of College and Cedar Street, so this is not the original location. A fire broke out in the church vestry room on Thursday morning, March 16th, 1893, and totally destroyed that original building. So Thursday, May 3rd, 1894, happened to be Ascension Day. The cornerstone of this building was laid. You see it right there. In impressive ceremonies conducted by Bishop Henry M. Jackson, assisted by the Reverends Peter Wager and Nehemiah Van Sickle. I love Nehemiah Van Sickle's name. Charles Shaw had the contract for the stone foundation, and the bricks were furnished by Mr. Carl Dice of Florence. Thus, this current building was constructed in 1894, incorporating the original bell tower, which was saved from the fire. The 1894 building was consecrated on Sunday, June 12, 1898, by Bishop Richard H. Wilmer. The parish hall just down there was built in 1929, and what is now Mullen Hall was erected in 1967 and named after the rector, Reverend Edward G. Mullen, who a lot of people still remember Reverend Mullen. He was a rector here until 1971 and just died like 20 or 25 years ago, something like that. In the 19th century, interestingly enough, Trinity also had one African-American congregant, a man known by locals as Uncle Lewis Moore, who was born in 1830 and died in 1896. Uncle Lewis had been a slave of Olivia Moore O'Neill's Moore relatives at the time that the O'Neills came from from Huntsville to Florence. In the late 1840s, Edward Asbury O'Neill, who would become a Confederate general and governor of Alabama, moved with he was a lawyer. He came with Olivia, his wife, Olivia Moore, and their family to Florence from Huntsville, and Uncle Lewis Moore was one of the slaves that came with them. Uncle Lewis was a sexton of Trinity Church and died in 1896 as a very respected member of both the black, he was respected by members of the white and the black community. So I think it's interesting that Trinity had one African-American congregant in the 19th century, a man named Lewis Moore, who had been a slave of the Moore and O'Neill families. And the final stop is First Methodist Church, and again, they have a historical marker. This is Florence's second oldest church, but before I do First Methodist, I want to just mention, I meant to do this at the First Congregational Church, mention Church Springs Methodist Episcopal Church, which is too far for us to walk to. They started around, I mentioned it briefly before we actually started on the tour when I was doing the sort of background. It began in 1839 with 13, 14 slaves or freedmen with assistance from white trustees of the Methodist Church. They met on the southwest corner of Court and Bluff Streets. So the historical marker that is across the street from the hamburger place needs to be 1 block south and west of where it is, because apparently when they put that marker up, they didn't actually look at the property deed for that property. The white trustees of the Methodist Church bought a brick cowshed, which the photo in the program is supposedly that brick cow barn that they converted into a church, these slaves and freedmen. They bought it from John H. Rapier Sr., the father of future Alabama Congressman James T. Rapier. John was a free mulatto barber of Florence, and he made enough money that he owned property all over Florence. So they bought that lot from him with the little church and a 10-foot access way on all sides of it. Their first pastor at Church Springs was the Reverend Robin Lightfoot, who was martyred during the Civil War by Confederate soldiers for some kind of public disturbance or strife. Some versions say it may have been agitation against the Confederacy. Some people say he was just being a public nuisance. We don't really know the specific examples, but Mrs. Eliza Weekly in her journal records that men from Johnson actually were under orders to lynch or to hang Reverend Lightfoot, which they did. He was a 60-odd-year-old man at that time, so I can't imagine what he was up to, but he was their first known pastor. At that time, they were still affiliated with the Methodist Episcopal Church South. They had not officially affiliated with the AME Church and wouldn't do so until they moved in 1879, 1880 to the corner of Court and Alabama Streets into the old Fant Wool Factory warehouse. They were there until 1895 at that location in the warehouse, which was built in the 1820s, so it was fairly old when they moved into it. At W.C. Handy's mother's funeral, sleepers under the floor collapsed, and it dropped the mourners 6 feet into the basement. The church had already been thinking we need a new building, but at that point they said, yeah, we definitely need a new building. So a local African-American barber, musician, and amateur architect named Constantine Constant Perkins Jr., who played with W.C. Handy and Maher's Minstrels, he designed the building for St. Paul AME Church on the corner of Court and Alabama Streets, which stood until 1967, at which time it was torn down, and now St. Paul exists on Cherokee Street, across from the Burrell School. So I wanted to, they're the oldest black congregation in Lauderdale County, hugely important, very important church in our town's history. If we had time, I'd talk about St. Mark's Missionary Baptist Church, which is the second oldest black congregation from 1859. But we're here at First Methodist, so I'm going to talk about this, and then we'll end the tour. This church was founded in 1822, so it's the second oldest church. Founded by local Methodist ministers John Cox and John Kerr in the front room of Cox's newly built log house in the 200 block of West Tuscaloosa Street. So this started as a house church. And in those days, churches like the Methodist Church had circuit riders on the frontier where they would they'd ride the circuit. So one Sunday they'd be at First Methodist doing the services. The next year, or the next Sunday, they'd be maybe at one of the Methodist churches out in the county. So like Wesley Chapel. So they would just make the circuit. From 1822 to 1825, the church met in Thomas Farmer's cobbler shop on West Mobile Street. The first actual meeting house was built in 1826 on West Tom Bigby and only moved in 1827 to East Tuscaloosa Street. And I couldn't find a really decent picture of that original meeting house. But an 1835 structure was modified in 1887, 1888, and a completely new sanctuary was built in 1905, which was dedicated on July 16th, 1905, and unfortunately got destroyed by fire on Thursday, January 21st. Was destroyed by fire on Thursday, January 21st, 1920, and the present building was constructed in 1924. Now, has anybody read T.S. Stribling's trilogy, the Ford's The Story of the Unfinished Cathedral? Well, supposedly the Unfinished Cathedral was inspired by events at First Methodist when, first of all, L.E. Tate was the contractor for the $100,000 sanctuary that was dedicated in 1924. But for some reason, the belfry was never completed. And I don't know why. I'm not sure if anybody knows now. I tried to look this up, why the belfry was not completed in 1924, but it wasn't. So supposedly T.S. Stribling used this as the basis of the inspiration for the third in his trilogy, The Unfinished Cathedral. So the Unfinished Cathedral allegedly refers to First Methodist Church being technically unfinished. In 1937, this is very interesting, and it speaks to the Jewish-Christian relationship in the Shoals. In 1937, Jewish businessman and member of Temple B'nai Israel, Louis Rosenbaum, prevented the sale of First Methodist Church by convincing the National Bank of New York to delay the sale until they could raise the money. And actually, Rosenbaum himself paid $4,000 balance on the mortgage, so it saved the church from being foreclosed on. And at another point in the church's history, Rosenbaum actually bought them a nice baptismal font, which they installed, and I think they are still using it. In 1965, the Rogers Memorial Chapel was built, and in 2001, they built their Christian Life Center, which is down and around the block. Between 1855 and 1872, the pastors of First Methodist Church were also presidents of Florence Wesleyan University, which began life in 1855 when LaGrange College relocated from Leeton to Florence under Reverend Dr. Richard H. Rivers, who was also one of the former ministers at First Methodist Church. It came here in 1855 amid some controversy. The Leeton people didn't want to see it go. The Florence people definitely wanted to see it come here. It moved anyway, but the state legislature wouldn't let them reopen the college under the name LaGrange, so they rechartered it under the name Wesleyan University, since it was a school chartered by the Methodist Church, which it existed as Florence Wesleyan University until 1872, at which time the Methodists deeded it to the state of Alabama. So it reopened shortly thereafter as Florence Normal School, which was a teacher training school, which finally became co-ed in the 1880s and now exists as the University of North Alabama. And of course, LaGrange reopened a few years after it relocated as a military academy, which was burned by Florence M. Cornyn in the Union Army in 1863. But initially, the pastors of First Methodist Church were presidents of Wesleyan University.